Hey guys, welcome to Question of Strength, where I basically talk about stuff that interests me and I hope will interest you. And then I cover your questions, which you can post at the right side of this presentation in the thing called the chat room, right? Hopefully, I'm going to get as many good questions as I typically do. And I have no fear of that because, as you know, how fun or interesting this gets is entirely dependent on the quality of your questions or if they actually allow me to get pissed off, that's probably even going to be better. Anyway, I want to start with a topic that was covered recently in tnation.com by Chris Schugert. And it refers to a strategy that I've promoted myself, that Jim Wender has promoted himself, using a protein shake prior to a meal. And the goal of that is not really to increase your protein intake, although that is a side effect of that. It's really to increase satiety. So when you are going to your meal, because the protein occupies space in your stomach and it also will blunt appetite, then it will reduce how much food you're going to be eating. So I'm going to covering that strategy as well as the opposite strategy of having the shake after your meal, which is for a different goal. But before that, I want to talk about protein and fat gain or fat loss, depending on what angle you want to look at it. Basically, it is pretty much impossible to store protein as body fat. Okay, so it's extremely hard to overeat protein from a body fat gain perspective. The reason why it's so unlikely that you will store protein as body fat is first because protein itself cannot be stored as fat. Okay, it needs to be converted. Just like glucose or carbohydrates cannot be directly stored as fat, they need to be converted into fatty acids, which is just one step. So that's fairly easy to do by the body. But to be able to store protein as body fat, you first need to convert that protein into carbohydrates or glucose. Okay, and then you need to convert that glucose into fatty acids, which now can be stored as body fat. But I'm going to explain why this is extraordinarily unlikely that it's going to happen. It really needs to be in a state of humongous caloric surplus for it to have a chance of happening. First, because you will only convert protein into glucose to a significant amount or extent if you are low on glucose. So you actually need to produce glucose because you're not feeding your body enough carbohydrates. Okay, so you need that to start converting protein into fat or starting the whole process. But when you think about that, if you are in a physiological state that you're so low on glucose, either from your stores or from nutrition, uh, well, you're not likely going to be in a state where you are going to pile on body fat because you are probably short on fuel. Okay, so that's really unlikely to happen. Uh, but more than because you're more likely to use that converted glucose as energy or to replenish muscle glycogen. Because the reason why you transformed those amino acids or protein into carbs and glucose in the first place is because you're low on glucose. Okay, Uh, so in if you're low on glucose, it probably needs that you are short on calories. Okay, now but let's just suppose that you indeed converted some protein into glucose. By the way, that conversion in the ideal state will be roughly between 30 and 50% efficient. So, for if you have an excess of 100 grams of protein that your body wants to turn into glucose, it can make 30 or 50 grams of glucose. It's not a one-to-one relationship. Okay. Now, let's just say that you are converting some protein into glucose. Your body decides to do that while glucose itself or carbohydrates are not as easy to store as body fat as most people make it out to be. Basically, as long as there's room in your muscles and liver to store carbohydrates as glycogen, you are unlikely to store a significant amount of uh, carbohydrates or glucose as fat. Okay, so let's just say that you did turn some protein into glucose, so now you have some glucose available. Well, unless the muscles are already filled with glycogen, you will likely either use that glucose for fuel or store it as in the form of muscle glycogen. So the only reason why the body would store it as fat is if the reserves built for to hold carbs in its natural state, the muscles, the liver, are already full. But you can see that doesn't make sense, because if you are in a state in which your body is looking to convert a significant amount of protein into glucose, it means that you are short on glucose, which is not something that happens when your muscles are filled with glycogen. So as you can see, that the physical state, unless you have some form of metabolic disorder, the the state you're in when you're converting protein into glucose is also a state where your muscle glycogen is very low. So worst case scenario, you will just store that converted protein as muscle glycogen, not as body fat. So as you can see, to have the conditions that you will store extra protein as fat are basically impossible to have. You need to have low muscle glycogen, but you also need to have full muscle glycogen. Make sense? I mean, if you want to store glucose as fat, you need to have full glycogen stores. If you want to convert protein to carbohydrates, you need empty glycogen stores. So both are very unlikely to happen. And again, unless you have some form of metabolic disorder. Okay, so you should really not be worried about gaining any fat at all from over consuming protein. I'm not telling you that there's no potential health effect. There might be, but from a fat gaining perspective, it's really not. It's not a problem that can happen. Okay. Now, people will think, well, yeah, if I eat too much protein foods, like eggs, like steaks, like fish, whatever, okay, I can gain fat. Sure, but it's not the protein in the food that makes you fat. It's that those foods that are rich in protein are typically also rich in fat. Okay, so it's if the more of these food you consume, also the more you will consume fat. So it's the fat that's being stored, not the protein. Like a protein shake is extraordinarily unlikely or pretty much impossible to store as body fat. Okay, so hopefully that cleared things out, and that's why I love the strategy that Chris wrote about recently. That because I wrote about it also, and so did Jim Wender. When you're in a fat loss phase, one of the biggest roadblock that people will face is because of the reduced food intake, they are not fully satiated when they are eating. So they tend to overeat because they don't feel satisfied. So they will have cravings and so on and so forth. Now, discipline can make you stick to the plan for a certain period of time, but eventually you will cave in. Now, where proteins, like a protein shake prior to a meal, will help is that it actually creates that sensation of fullness. So if you have that protein shake before a meal, it will actually probably make you eat less or crave less food, and or be more easily satisfied by the smallest food intake you have at your meal. Also, it will give you more protein, which you probably need when you are dieting down, because you want to prevent muscle loss as much as possible. Okay. By the way, one more thing that can also make it very hard for protein to be stored as fat is that just the fact that you are ingesting a higher amount of protein increases the thermic effect of the meal. So basically, when you are eating, you are also using energy to digest the food. Protein, of all the three main macronutrients, is the macronutrients that requires the most energy to be digested. So if you increase the protein content of a meal, that meal itself will require more fuel to be digested. So it might actually, like from a calories in versus calories out balance, it might actually makes it easier to be in a deficit without having to reduce food as much, just because you're expending more energy to digest the food. That's called thermic effect of feeding. Okay. So one strategy, again, if you want to lose fat, is to consume a protein shake prior to your main meals. Now, I'm going to preach from my own choir here, because I love metabolic drive for that purpose. Not okay. First, it is a great protein, but the main reason is simply, I would say, mechanical. It's a thicker protein than whey proteins, because it has some casein hydrolysate, so the consistency of the shake is thicker, and that will obviously make you feel fuller than a protein that is basically has the same consistency as water. Okay, so that's one of the main benefits. It also is a slower digesting protein, so it fills you up for a bit longer. Now, what if you're not trying to lose fat? You're trying to build muscle, but you're having a hard time. One strategy you can use is to do the opposite. So after a meal, you can have a protein shake. Those who are having a hard time building muscle are often under eating, uh, maybe because they are afraid of gaining fat, or maybe because they just don't have much appetite. So the protein foods, like I mentioned earlier, like steak, like eggs, like fish, poultry, and so on and so forth, they might have a hard time consuming a large amount of those to be at the protein intake required for them to build muscle. So I think a shake after or at the end of the three main meals of the day will certainly goes a long way about making the protein intake optimal for muscle growth without increasing the risk of adding body fat in the process. Okay, so that would be a good strategy. Now, if you want to really go the extra mile to maximize anabolism or muscle growth, you could actually precede every meal or every main meal that has a pretty high protein content with 3 to 5 grams of leucine that will be consumed probably like 10-15 minutes prior to the meal. Now, there's a thing called the leucine threshold, meaning that for a meal to trigger anabolism or muscle growth, okay, beyond the natural state, so basically enhancing the anabolic state, your meal needs to have roughly 3 to 5 grams of leucine. Now, of course, if you're eating protein foods, you will have some leucine in there. But again, if you are not someone with a big appetite, it might be hard to get enough leucine. Furthermore, if that leucine is mixed in with other amino acids, for example, eating a steak, you have leucine, but you also have all the other amino acids, some of which can compete with leucine for absorption, it might actually reduce the anabolic impact of leucine. Leucine is very anabolic because it increases the activation of mTOR. And mTOR is what triggers protein synthesis. You want to increase protein synthesis before you provide protein to your body. Because if your machinery, your protein synthesis machinery is elevated, then you feed it tons of protein, then you can use that protein better to build muscle. Okay. So if you're having that 3 to 5 grams of leucine, let's say 15 minutes or so prior to the meal, because it's just an isolated amino acid, it will enter the bloodstream and be absorbed really, really fast. So if you have that prior to having solid food, it will be absorbed a lot better than if it just added to the meal. Okay. So that will actually put you in that anabolic state. Then you have your meal. So the meal actually becomes a lot more anabolic. Now you can use straight leucine powder, or you can, if you are someone who's a hard gainer, having a hard time building muscle, you can actually use Surge Workout Fuel for that purpose. Surge Workout Fuel has a hefty dosage of leucine, so you probably can just go with half a serving of Surge Workout Fuel 15 minutes prior to a meal. It will give you the leucine to trigger the mTOR, and it has some carbs in there. The mTOR will actually increase mTOR also. So that will actually be a pretty good way to boost your calories, boost your anabolism if you're having a hard time adding weight. So these are strategies you can use for building muscle or losing fat and using protein to do so. So for example, if you want to lose fat, simple strategy, just have a protein shake roughly 10 minutes before a meal. It can be as close as 5 minutes, really. Because it's just mechanical. It doesn't need to be fully absorbed to work. It just need to be in your stomach to give you a sense of fullness. And if you want to build maximum muscle, I would start with leucine 10 to 15 minutes earlier, or half a serving of Surge Workout Fuel, then adding your meal, then finishing with a protein shake afterwards. That would turbocharge your anabolism beyond the doubt. Shadow it out. All right. I'm training my son. In fact, he actually always asks to train because I train at home most of the time. So when I train, my son always trains with me. And yesterday, we actually started introducing him to full squat clean. He's 5 years old. And honest to God, this morning, is squat clean. And he's squat clean body weight, which is pretty good for years old. He's moving under the bar faster than I ever did when I competed. I'm super jealous of his technique right now. And we also started including the jerk, which I believe is the hardest Olympic lift to master. So right now he's doing power snatches, he's doing squat clean, he's doing jerks. technique drills. He's also doing floor presses. He's doing curls because you need big biceps. He's doing Atlas stone lift. I have medicine balls ranging from 10 pounds to 30 pounds. So he does Atlas stone lift with the ball, which is pretty cool. Does all the carries, abdominal work, and he also does boxing, karate, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty cool to see because kids learn stuff so quick. I mean, I'm actually amazed at how quickly he picked up moving under the bar. Because when I trained CrossFit individuals with some people, it would take them like, I don't know, 10 sessions to be able to go from a power clean because in CrossFit, oftentimes they don't even move under the bar. So going from being able to do their power clean to a squat clean oftentimes will take 5, 6, 7, 8 sessions just to get the feeling, and even longer to actually squat clean more than they were power cleaning. Jaden is now pretty close to that, but he's squat cleaning the same as he's power cleaning in one session. So that always amazing. I also bought a kid squat rack from Rogue because the bar he has is too short to fit on regular on my squat racks. I'm just built. I just bought a squat rack so he can do front squat because right now he's limited to run a front squat lift by how much he can clean, and that's an easy way for him to squat. All right, let's get to your questions. What do you think of using just bands during a deload so there is less muscle damage to recover from, but keeping the volume and effort pretty much the same? I've used that method, but not just with bands. I'm going to explain why in a moment. And I didn't use the regular band setting where you attach the bar in the bottom of the rack, then on the bar. I would do the opposite. I would use the reverse band techniques. I would attach the band at the top of the power rack, and then let the bar hang in the band, the bar in the band. Obviously, you cannot use all bands for that purpose because you need at least 135 for be able to go down with the weight, depending on the size of the bands you're using. Uh, the reason why I prefer the reverse band for the purpose you mentioned is that the reverse band actually provides you with a true deload. Okay, you might think, well, both are the same because if you attach the bands at the bottom of the rack, you still have much less load in the bottom when the bands are not stretched, and there's more resistance at the top when they are stretched. But what actually happens is when the bands are fully stretched, well, what happens is they're not just adding weight; they are trying to push you down. So that greatly increases the eccentric stress. Granted, you have less load at the bottom, but in the first half of the movement, that downward push actually increases the stress and potential muscle damage. Okay, yes, you have less load in the lengthened position, but the bends themselves would cause an excessive trauma due to the extremely intense eccentric action due to the either because of the increase in speed or because you're resisting the band's push downward. When you are using a reverse band approach, okay, it does not have that enhanced eccentric. If anything, the band reduces the eccentric stress during the lowering phase, and it decreases it even more. So in both cases, you are unloading the bottom position, but with the normal band setup, the increase in eccentric activity also basically nullify the benefit of unloading the lengthened portion. Also, if you are using only bands, and that's why I don't like using only bands, especially on movements where you're very strong, like a squat, like a deadlift, especially squat, deadlift, it would be less of a problem because you're starting from the bottom position. But squat, what happens is when you are unracking the bar, same thing on the bench press, if you are only using band, it will just wobble. It's very hard to control. Ironically, the more weight you put on the bar, the easier squatting or benching with bands is because the load anchor the load in place. It nullifies the swinging action. Well, maybe not nullify it, but it greatly decreases it. The wobbling oscillatory action of the band. But just try it for yourself. Go on a bench, okay, and load band so that you have close to your, let's say, 5 or 8 RM at the top, unrack that bar. You'll be all over the place. Now decrease the band resistance a bit and add, let's say, a 45 on each side. Even if the top weight is the same, it's going to be much easier to unrack and hold that bar in a proper position. So that's why I don't like using only bands for movements like a squat, a bench, like an overhead press, and so on and so forth. Okay. On deadlift, it would be less of a problem. On of course, on movement like curls, it's not a problem at all. But on the big basic lift, it might become problematic, especially if you're on a deload where you might actually increase neurological stress rather than reduce it because of that need for stabilization. So yeah, the concept is sound, but not with all that and not with bands in the bottom. It's reverse band that would we would probably shoot for band resistance that would decrease the bottom load by roughly 50%. So that would certainly allow you to keep training fairly hard while reducing muscle damage. Because don't forget that the goal of a deload is not just to reduce muscle stress, it's to reduce neurological stress also. So the reverse band approach is much superior in that regard. However, it should not be done for too long. So maybe one workout per lift, because what I find is that, and that's the biggest drawback of chains and bands, but mostly bands, is that they change the resistance profile of the exercise. So in a normal squat or a normal bench uh, or normal deadlift, you are weaker in the bottom position, so it's harder in the bottom and it's easier at the top. When you're using bands or reverse band or chains, it changes that. It makes the lift easier from the bottom and harder from the top. So the more you stick with that resistance profile, the more your actual technique on the regular bench, regular squat, regular deadlift will be negatively impacted. That's why also I don't really like bands and chains anymore, except if I want to fix a specific range of motion. Range of motion. If we have weak triceps, I'm going to chain bands at that close grip that works. But the problem is that you never actually strengthen the weak point of the lift. So by underloading the bottom, which is typically where you are the weakest, like, so my sticking point is not in the bottom of the squat; it's in the mid range of the squat. Yeah, but the sticking point is not where you're weak. The sticking point is where you ran out of steam from your weak point. So let's say that your weak point in the squat is the bottom position. It means that when you start the lift, you have a problem creating acceleration. So once you reach a point where, well, you just die out because you lack speed, that's where you fail. But your sticking point is actually lower than what your filling point. It's for it, imagine that your sticking point, sticking is the proper term because it's sticky, right? And what does a sticky surface does? Let's say you're driving a car and you hit a patch of mud, it's sticky, it will slow you down because it prevents you from going fast. So that's what a sticking point does. The part of the movement where you are slowing down, slowing down. Maybe because of mechanical disadvantage, maybe because of a weak muscle. But you start reducing your speed, and if you reduce your speed so much, eventually you just stop. The bar stops moving, and that's where you fail. But you did not fail because you're weak at where you failed. You fail because a few centimeters, a few inches lower is when you started decelerating and you reach a point where it was impossible to maintain the velocity. So even if your weak point is like in the middle range of your squat, then the bottom portion is still a weak link. Uh, so really chains and bands, they rarely transfer well to regular lifts because they don't strengthen the weak part of the motion. But they were great for equipped powerlifters because if you are an equipped powerlifter, like West Side guys, you are using a squat suit and a bench shirt, which also change the resistance profile of a lift. Because of the supreme stretch of the material, you actually become stronger in the bottom position. It's easier, and well, you're not stronger, but the equipment does the work for you. But the point is that the bottom position, it's easier and it's harder in the top. So the chains and bends mimic the resistance profile that you have in the powerlifting, but it's the opposite as with regular lifting. So it's certainly not a strategy that you would want to use for more than a couple of workouts per lift. Otherwise, you might have a pollution of your movement pattern. All right, good question. And if you have any questions at any point, you can just type them in the chat room. The more good questions we have, the more interesting it gets. Uh, I just found that when I cut volume and intensity down by 25-50% for deload, I lose the motivation to do any of it, and I just take the whole weeks off. That's what I would call the hockey players phenomenon. Because when I hockey players, pro hockey players, and high level hockey players, that always happen, always happen. Maybe they didn't stop training because they had to show up. Okay, but they certainly did not take those sessions seriously to a point where we actually stopped using deep weeks at the end of the clock. We still use deload, but I'm gonna tell you how I did it to like circumvent the problem. And I think that it's not so much a decrease in volume itself that is the problem. It's the psychological, I would say, outlook of sessions. Okay, because in your mind, deload means I'm just taking it, and there's no point in training hard because I'm not going to give it anyway. Okay, so just the best example of that is that the athletes, the hockey players, used to call those easy weeks, as in I'm taking it easy. But the problem they don't understand is that the reduction in volume makes it unnecessary to not push themselves hard because there will be a deload effect. In your mind, because the volume is down, it's not real training, so we're doing it. And that's 100% psychological. They would never tell you that it was subconscious. Okay, but that certainly is something. I'm going to use an example which is not deload related, but personally with my own training. Okay, if I don't have the feeling that I'm training for a very specific goal, I'm losing a lot of my motivation to train now because I've basically been almost every day for the past 30 years, 35 years. It's like part of my persona to go train anyway, but it's certainly not quality sessions. I'll lose motivation. I need to feel that what I'm doing today will help me reach my goal. If I don't have, I'm going to give you an example. Okay, right now I'm training mostly for performance. Two main performance goals right now. I want to improve my capacity for boxing, so striking power and also endurance. And I want to become good at the snatching. Are my two goals. So everything I'm doing needs somewhat related to improving one of those things. Anything that is not connected to that, you would not pay me to do it. Like there's just no way I would be doing lateral raises or curls right now. You could not pay me. But I love doing squats because I know it can help my snatch. I love doing RDL because I know it can help my squat, my snatch. On the other hand, if I'm doing a photo shoot, I know that I need to look shredded and look good for mostly for the upper body because I'm wearing shorts anyway. I can't get enough of curls, lateral raises, back tacks, and so on and so forth. But you will not pay me to do squats. See how it works? If you don't have the feeling that what you are doing will help you achieve your goal, then you lose motivation. So in your mind, okay, because I'm doing so much less volume, it's not going to help me. That's subconscious. Then you lose interest. Okay. So what we did to basically still get somewhat of a deload effect without putting you in the psychological mode that you don't care about the workout is you the first week of a new block where you introduce new exercises, new training methods, new loading schemes, and so new tempos. You use that week where you have to and weight to less because you need to adapt to new stimulus. We use that to so it's an introductory load. It's not a deload. You are learning the new methods. You are learning the new exercises. You're getting comfortable with them so that next week you can push them hard. So here's the fact that you have a learning and you see it as an introduction, normally it keeps you motivated to train. The effect is the same because you still have that reduction in stress. Because when you're introducing new exercises, even if you keep on high, you just don't push yourself as high because you want proper technique, proper mechanics, and so on and so forth. So it has kind of the same deloading effect without actually being a deload. It's an introductory deload. So psychologically speaking, subconsciously, it's a different mindset, and that really helps you avoid those, I would say, deload blues. All right. is the high effort method with one subset suitable for neck training? Strictly from a physiological standpoint, yes. From a real life application, I would say no. To me, neck training is kind of like abs. Okay, it responds better to higher volumes of work, higher reps, and probably more frequency. Okay, the reason I think is a matter of loading the neck super heavy might not be the best idea until you're really good at neck exercises. So it's probably safer to use a lighter weight. And to make a lighter weight effective, you need to do more reps and probably do a bit more sets. And that's the way I do it. That's the way Jim Wonder does it. So, and that's how wrestler did it. I mean, they would do longer duration exercises several times a week, oftentimes several exercises in the workout. So could it work? Absolutely. Muscle is muscle. But from a safety perspective, it's not where I go with training the neck. I personally like training neck. I'm training it less now because it's not something that I might reintroduce it because for boxing it helps absorb shocks. But I remember last summer, having a big neck and big traps was my main goal. So I would start every workout with neck and grip training, either grip or forearm. Um, and I found that doing neck exercises to a non-failure point, so maybe like 3 or 4 sets of 20-25 reps, not to failure but pretty high effort, actually helped me perform better in my workout. Maybe like the neck exercise created some room for the nerve impulse to pass. I don't know, but it did seem to help my workout. That's what I did. I've been slowly losing weight, so I want to start adding calories rather than reduce activity. That's smart. Is there a consideration as to whether to go fat or carbs? I would go with carbs. I mean, the only, and I explained this in the beginning of this podcast, is carbohydrates are actually much harder to store as fat as people believe they are. Okay, as long as muscle glycogen is not full, you are most likely going to store those carbohydrates as muscle glycogen. That's the first thing. Now, second thing is that people associate gaining fat from carbs food to stuff like pastries, stuff like ice cream, stuff like I don't cake, uh, basically sources that are rich in both carbs and fat, and that's a really bad recipe. Okay, but pure carbs food are harder to store as fat as most people think. However, they can make you retain water and give you the impression that you're gaining. That might be an illusion, but as far as gaining fat is concerned, unless you go like crazy high, that overfills your muscle glycogen, yeah, you're going to store that as fat. But as long as you are conservative and you still have room in your muscles, it's unlikely to be stored as fat. Second, carbohydrates have more benefit from a muscle building perspective than yes, fats are involved in the production of some anabolic hormones like testosterone and so on and so forth. So it's not completely useless. A diet too low in fat will indeed lead to lower testosterone level over time. But you probably are having some sufficient amount of fat in your diet if you're having stuff like poultry, like fish, like fatty fish, like meat, for example. So that should not be an issue from a normal standpoint. Carbohydrates will increase, first of all, muscle glycogen. So it gives you both more energy for intense muscle work, but it also gives you better leverage. By increasing muscle glycogen storage, you're also increasing water storage inside the muscle. Each gram of glucose is filled with 3 grams of water, so it blows up your muscle, which is better, but it also gives you a mechanical leverage for strength, so that actually make you stronger. So that would be time to train more harder. That would be a benefit. Also, carbohydrates will increase anabolic hormones like IGF-1 and insulin, which will help you build muscle. That's why it's much harder to build muscle on a keto diet because hormonally speaking and enzymatically speaking, it's less anabolic because carbohydrates also increase mTOR. I mentioned earlier in my protein strategy bit that mTOR activates synthesis and thus muscle building. Carbs do that. Fat stuff doesn't. And lastly, carbohydrates will help you lower cortisol. Fat will not. So carbohydrates would be a much. only situation where I would probably be worried about adding too much carbohydrates is if someone has poor insulin sensitivity. So in that case, I would probably like add some fat and some carbs. But if someone has a normal physiology, those so they have no metabolic disorder, I would probably. That doesn't mean cake. That doesn't mean candy. It means fruits. It means uh, stuff like rice. That would be a good choice. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, and so on and so forth. All right. Regarding the bands, exactly for raw lifter, they need to be strongest in the most leadership. Absolutely. Another point for that is Dan Green. I mean, if you look at the West Side, I'm using Westside because they basically are the kings of bands and chains. And for what they're doing, it is the proper approach because they are lifting in equipped powerlifting, which changes the resistance profile. So bands and chains are actually mimicking what they need for competition. So their use of chains and bands is justified and super smart. But for most of us, it's not. Um, you look at the assistance exercises that Westside uses for the bench, they rarely use pectoral exercises. And if they do, it's going to be like very high rep dumbbell presses, mostly to build the tendon, um, to reduce injury potential. But most of their assistance work is done for triceps, 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 some delts, triceps, triceps, some delts, lats, lats, okay, and so on and so forth. The lats are important to stabilize even with the shirt. And the triceps is what they really need because they need to be super strong at the end of the range of motion, which is where the triceps shine. Dan Green said that the most important muscle to train for raw bench pressing is the pectoral, the chest. Okay, because when you are not using a shirt, you need to be stronger in the bottom position, and the chest contributes more in that position. Triceps become less important, relatively speaking. Okay, they're not important. Same thing for the squat. West Side, what do they emphasize? First, the squatting style used by West Side or basically equipped lifters is a squat style, and that's what something that people don't understand. Like for example, Matt Wenning recommend a squat style where you will squat sitting as far back as you can, so that the tibias actually becomes perpendicular to the floor, as opposed to what most IPF lifters, Olympic weightlifters, and when they're squatting, the tibia is angled forward. The reason for that is yes, it makes if you keep the chins perpendicular, it becomes more of a posterior chain squat. Okay, because the posterior chain is stretched more than the quads. But what people don't understand is that this form of squatting, which also led to the invention of the box squat, this type of squatting stretches the suit more than the more upright knees forward squat. So the squat where you sit back to have perpendicular chins is what will take advantage of the suit the most. And because it becomes a posterior chain squat, that's why West Side, most assistance exercises for the squat is posterior chain, where you do very, very little quadriceps work. Ton of hamstring, tons of glutes, tons of lower back. That's what they do because the squat style they're using needs those muscles a lot more than quads. They don't have a bigger quad. Okay, and the style is actually what helps them get the most out of their squat suit. Now, if you are a raw lifter, I would say that a slightly more upright style, maybe not a high bar, but more upright, depending on your levers, and with more tibia angling forward, will increase quadricep activation. So for a raw powerlifter, and that's what Dan Green said too, you need to emphasize the quads a lot. The front squat, leg presses, axe squats, even some leg extensions because for those who are not using the squat suit style of squatting, the quadriceps becomes the dominant muscle in the squat, so you need to train it more. So that's why when you look at recommendation, training advice, and so on and so forth, you need to look at the concept on which these methods were originally developed. All right. Lifetime natural, 57 years old, arms are not growing, very low sets, reps in the 10 to 15, loaded stretches twice per week. Okay, I'm guessing you are asking what to do. Uh, well, first, and that's a weird thing. I've noticed that, and pretty much anybody in the bodybuilding world has noticed that too. Is that when you're getting older, it seems like arms and legs are the first thing to go, or the hardest thing to keep building as you're getting older. Like chest, back, shoulders, that can all grow pretty well even when you're getting older. But for some reason, arms and legs will sometimes, well, it's going to be harder to build and gradually decrease in size. Uh, I have two theory about that. The first one could be like nerve damage from the years of abuse. Maybe not just damage, but sometimes, for example, at a shoulder capsule, doing lots of bench pressing, pec work over the years can close up the little room where you all the nerves go through, so it compresses them a bit, and that can actually decreases your capacity to activate the bicep and tricep and forearm. That could be one reason. The other reason could be a gradual development of insulin resistance as you're getting older. For some reason, insulin resistance or diabetes oftentimes affect the limbs by reducing their size. So that's just two things I can believe. So one thing that I would recommend, okay, and that's going to sound weird, okay, but that really helped me. If the problem is indeed like poor neurological transmission, hanging from a pull-up bar. So you can use straps, doesn't matter. Just hang from a pull-up bar, shooting for around 1 minute per day at first. Eventually, you can build that up to 2 minutes. You might not be able to hang for the full minute at first. It might be too uncomfortable. You might do like 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds. It doesn't really matter. Just get up to 1 minute every single day. And eventually you'll find that you can get up to 2 minutes or maybe even more. Okay. And that over time will actually change the structure of your shoulder, okay, to create room for that will first decrease shoulder injury, shoulder pain. It will bulletproof your shoulders, but it can also reduce that nerve compression, and that will make it easier to recruit biceps and triceps. So that's literally the first thing I would look at rather than training technique. When training young athletes at school age, how do you prioritize force velocity? Listen ball throws, jumps, sprints, when their strength base is still being built up. Um, yeah, I've had lots of experience training high school athletes. It's probably the I would say the age range that I've trained the most people, because for a few years I was responsible for a sports studies program where we had high school athletes from 26 different sports. I've also trained figure skaters who were like national level, ranging from 12 to 18 years of age. I've trained several football teams because I myself was a football coach for 12 years. And right now I'm training my son, my son's 5. Um, and the answer I'm going to give you will be completely different than the answer you would have gotten to me 5 or 10 years ago. 5 or 10 years ago, I was a pure strength coach. My belief, because I came from weightlifting, also came from the Polican school of thought, which was based on two things: getting stronger and getting better body condition with athletes. I was brought up thinking that the most important thing for an athlete was to get stronger. And that's how I programmed for athletes. And it worked, because, I mean, very rarely will an athlete become worse by becoming a lot stronger. Right? Uh, but what I noticed is that the more I grew up and the more data I review, the more athletes I work with, strength, unless we're talking about very specific sports and very specific position, like an offensive lineman in football, like uh, maybe a judo player that is more or shot putter is more strength related. Most athletes will be short by 1 yard rather than short by 1 pound. If that makes sense. In other words, speed and power are vastly more important than strength. And the truth is that and it used to be that we believe, and it's correct in some regard, that strength work will help you make you more powerful. It will help you make you become faster. Okay, that's true to a limited extent. In fact, that strength will help you get more powerful and faster, mostly by improving the capacity of the central nervous system to recruit the fast twitch fibers. So if you have someone who has a poor capacity to recruit his fast twitch fibers, he will not be able to be good in explosive exercises. By doing strength work, you increase that the strength of his signal, and now he becomes better at explosive work. That's how it works. Okay? Also, if you are like stronger, then a medicine ball you need to throw becomes lighter relative to your maximum strength. So that could be a factor too. But past a certain point, strength is not going to be the make or break factor unless you're involved in a sport where you actually need static strength. Okay, or you now speed is what you need, and that's what I noticed in the training of athletes. There's a much greater emphasis on explosiveness, and I 100% abide to that. If you go onto my website tiparmy.com, you look for an article called something like the true purpose of strength training for sport or something like that. I explain all of that and why strength is of limited value after a certain point. The reason is that from a neurological standpoint, strength or slow, hard contractions don't have the same recruitment pattern as an explosive contraction. On T Nation, I did post a graphic showing the difference between both. In a fast action, explosive action, okay, it's a triphasic muscle recruitment pattern. So basically, and keep in mind that is over a very, very, very short period of time, you will first have a burst in activation of the agonist muscle and their synergists, the muscle that actually are involved in moving the load or moving you fast. Okay, and at the same time, there's a relative inhibition of the antagonist muscle, the muscles opposing. The reason why the body does that is that during explosive movements, the body prioritizes acceleration over stability. Okay, a greater activation of the antagonist muscles at the same time as the agonist creates joint stability. If you want to go fast, that will slow you down. Okay, so at first you're going to have a very high burst in agonist and synergist activation and a relative inhibition of the antagonist. Again, that's milliseconds long. Then you will have the opposite, a peak in antagonist contraction and the relative relaxation of the agonist to create stability once the initial burst of acceleration has been created. And then, keep in mind, that's all in milliseconds. There will be a second peak in agonist or synergist muscles and a relative inhibition of the antagonist to create maximum velocity. That's how it works. Okay. In strength work or heavy loaded contraction that are slower, it's monophasic. So there's just a regular activation of the agonist and synergist, and there's a background co-contraction of the antagonist to create more stability. So during very heavy lifts, you value being stable more than being fast. Because the moment you're not stable, the body will protect itself by inhibiting force production. So you can be really good in one type of action and really bad in another type of action. You're going to say, yeah, but Christian, we have plenty of sprinters that squatted like 500 or 600 and they're super fast. So the squats certainly help them. Yeah, but you also have sprinters who are just as fast, who didn't just as fast and didn't squat at all. Uh, the reason for the fact that they were able to lift heavy and sprint fast is more so the matter that, physiologically speaking, having the genetic makeup to be super strong or super fast also helps you get strong. You have more fast twitch fibers, more efficient nervous system, so you're naturally going to be better at strength movement if you train. Okay, so it's not that the more stronger you get, the faster you get. It's just the fact that your body, if it's optimally built for speed, it will respond easily to strength work. So I would say that for me, I would actually prioritize explosive work. That doesn't mean I don't do strength work. We still are looking to get stronger, but I do prioritize explosiveness, especially with young kids, because that's when you're building the movement pattern. That's when you're developing an ability. If you try later to try to become explosive, it's going to be a much harder path. Like with my son, for example, which is only 5, he's not high school. But I was having this discussion with a chiropractor about what I did to introduce my kid to training. So the first year, all we did was jumps. Well, that's not 100% accurate. He was doing jumps and he was doing loaded carries. That's what we did. Okay, for about a year, just jumps, 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 broad jumps, box jumps, step jumps, side to side jumps, hurdle jumps, anywhere, any form of jumping. Then we actually started doing medicine ball throws, and we always made it into a game. For example, I have my blocks that I use for when I'm dropping my snatches. They're like big foam blocks, and I would build a castle within the block, my blocks. And we have a 2 pound medicine ball. One is 2 pounds, one is four, and he would just try to destroy the castle by throwing the medicine ball. So, and that was the second introduction that we did, and that went on for about a year. Then we introduced basic movement patterns, like a squat movement pattern, like a press movement pattern, so on and so forth. And now we are in the process of introducing the Olympic lifts. So right now, He's doing power snatches from the hang. He's doing uh, power cleans from the hang. He's doing full cleans now. He actually like full squat clean body weight very easily this morning. We are introducing the jerk, which is harder to learn. We're doing floor presses. We're doing still medicine ball throws, still lots of jump, but you can never do too much explosive work. Well, you can, but you get my meaning. And that should really be the emphasis because, and I've seen it, and just look at football players. I mean, that's only one sport, but like the average linebacker used to be like 250, 255, maybe 245 on the lighter side. Now you have plenty of linebackers who are 215, 220, 225, but they're hell of a lot faster. So speed is king. Keep in mind that if you're a high school athlete, you literally have between between 8 to 10 years to build muscle and get stronger. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're not 250 by the time you're 18. Okay, you still have 4 years of college to build that. So the faster you build muscle or size, the more likely you are to not be able to carry that weight well. So you should focus on performance, and size will follow to some extent to be effective. All right. Can one still train hamstrings and lower back after getting a pinched nerve or herniated disc? I'm really not comfortable answering that question because first, injuries are not my area of expertise. It's not my lane. Second, I don't feel comfortable in even if it was my lane, I would not feel comfortable answering an injury-related question online without being able to assess the person because not all herniated discs have the same impact on people. So I'm honestly can't give you an answer. I'm really sorry about that. What's the better attribute to focus on? Speed strength or speed endurance? Depends on your sport. Uh, and I wouldn't say not necessarily unless you're a sprinter, like speed endurance is not really a thing that is useful. I prefer to think in terms of anaerobic capacity. That's a different thing. Although speed endurance falls in the umbrella of anaerobic capacity. Anaerobic capacity is being able to maintain a high level of intense anaerobic effort for longer. But in that case, it's not limited to just speed or running. It can include any action done fairly fast or very heavy or fairly demanding. Okay, uh, and again, it depends on the sport. But what I will say is, okay, speed strength, just like speed, will kill you. But if you cannot maintain it, it can kill you for like a play. If you're a football player, uh, the better conditioning or the better anaerobic capacity you have, the more you can maintain your speed, strength, and speed. Okay. What I noticed is that people who get burned out, like who burn like you're a hockey player and then you just do a bad move and then they score a goal. Same thing with soccer. Same thing when you do mental mistakes, when you do technique mistakes. It always happens when you are tiring yourself out. Okay, the best defensive players in hockey, for example, or basketball players, always are those who have the better conditioning, the better anaerobic capacity, because they are not killable. If you're a fighter, boxer, uh, MMA guy, again, you cannot overcome poor conditioning, poor anaerobic capacity. You can be strong as hell, you can be powerful as hell. You'll be easy to beat just by getting you winded and then you're done. So I want to say that strictly from a sports performance standpoint, speed strength is probably better. But in reality, conditioning will more often be the limiting factor. And do you believe in remapping muscle fibers, like fast twitch fibers from quads and lats for Olympic lifting or track and field? What do you mean? Like changing the ratio of fast twitch fiber to slow twitch fiber or vice versa? If that's what you mean, yes, I actually created a whole online course about how you can convert slow twitch fibers into fast twitch fibers by using different methods. It used to be believed that it could not be done. It used to be believed that you can convert fast twitch fibers into slow twitch fibers with endurance activity, but the reverse is not possible. Although that was done because that was concluded because the way to assess the muscle fiber type was really, really inefficient back then. Newer research has shown that it is in fact possible to change slow twitch fibers into fast twitch fibers or intermediate fibers. And it can actually be done fairly quickly. Like, there was a study that I read in which you can actually convert slow twitch fibers or intermediate fibers into fast twitch fibers by 10% in 6 weeks. So it is absolutely possible to do that. Now, do you need a special strategy to do it? Maybe, maybe not. I think that simply training for what your sport requires will naturally make you move in that direction. Uh, I'm going to use myself as an example. I always saw myself as more of a slow twitch fiber. I was not explosive when I was younger. My, my best 40-yard dash when I played football was 5'1", which is super slow. And my best vertical jump was 26 inches. And that was despite training for sprinting and jumping. But I was training more like a bodybuilder and very lifting heavy. When I switched to weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting, after 3 years of that, and that's without sprinting, I got tested at university for my vertical jump, and I jumped 40 inches. And that was done on a force plate with also a potentiometer attached to my waist. So we actually measured the vertical displacement. So that was 100% accurate. And also my 40-yard sprint went from the original 5'1" to 4.56 laser. So that was pretty darn fast. And I did limited sprinting at that time, but I did lots of jumping, and all my lifting was explosive. Not because I tried to convert my fibers, but because I was doing weightlifting. The nature of the sport is you need to be explosive, especially since I was not efficient moving under the bar. I would power snatch everything, power everything. So I always move very, very fast. And so it happened. So I believe that. But do you need to use special methods? You can. If you're really someone who's like you don't have any fast fiber profile at all, and you need that, then I have a whole course on how to do that. Even on T Nation, I have an article called, I think, Becoming a Fast Twitch Machine, in which I detail some of these techniques. But it is absolutely doable. In some cases, you might need to do that. In other cases, your training for your sport might actually do that for you, especially over time. I'm not going to answer a newer type question. I'm sorry. I never do that on online courses because it's very niche. And I don't want to spend 10 minutes answering questions nobody wants to hear. I would just want to say that I am coming up probably like in March with an update on the course that has a lot more info about training each newer type, both from a coaching intervention standpoint as well as a programming standpoint. Coach, have you heard of Su Bing Tian, a professional Chinese track and field athlete who trained fastest only? Are you talking about the guy who beat the 60 meters record with like 5'8" with very short legs, the worst build for a squatter for a sprinter? Yet he is essentially the fastest human being because top speed is reached at 60 meters, and he's faster than Usain Bolt in 60 meters. I've seen a video of him, if that's who you're referring to. He did. I mean, again, most sprinters will train almost exclusively fast twitch fibers. The thing that is the least fast twitch fiber that sprinters will do is lifting. Yeah, but everything else they do is fast twitch fiber. They do lots of jumping, lots of rebound work. But from what I've seen of him, if that's who you're talking about, he seemed to do a lot more uh, fast movement, even fast unloaded movement than regular sprinters to overcome the fact that his legs were shorter. So when your legs are shorter, automatically your stride length is shorter. So you need higher stride frequency to compensate for that. And I know that he was doing a lot of like he was hanging on the box, the feet not touching the floor, and just going super fast. So that would be very, very fast twitch dominant. So basically, the more loaded something is, the less fast twitch it becomes. Well, it can be fast twitch in the 2A sense, but the true explosive fast twitch are the two X's. The moment you start loading a movement and you're not moving at maximum velocity, you are converting those two X's into 2A. So from what I've seen of it, if that's who you're referring to, I've seen him do a lot of that. So did a bobsleigh guy I trained. We eventually transitioned into track and field. He wanted to be the first white guy to get 100 meters under 10 seconds. He was super fast on 60 meters. Like he literally, at the bobsleigh test, he would run faster than the world record. However, keep in mind that he used a laser timing, so there was no reaction time being involved, but he was still like super fast. When we sprinted together, every time we would come off the block, it's like it was being shot out of a cannon. Like the noise it made was extremely impressive. Anyway, he was never able to reach that because he had two jobs and he was getting older, so he never reached his potential. But he was doing a lot of those very high velocity unload. Yeah, that's what. One last question. For most lifters, is the barbell row useful, or will chest supported row along with RDLs cover it? I don't like the barbell. And again, that doesn't mean it's not a good exercise. I mean, I feel bad about saying that I don't like the barbell row because there was a time where that was almost the only back exercise people could do, and it was the mainstream most bodybuilder arsenal. Most of the best bodybuilders prior to 1990 used the barbell row. It did build up the muscle. I'm not saying you it doesn't work. But with what we have now, equipment wise, I just don't see any need to do a barbell row unless it's a pendlay row. I do use pendlay rows a lot, but only for strength athletes, very rarely for bodybuilders. Because from a hypertrophy standpoint, you spend so much neural drive to activate the lower back that you have less neural drive available to contract the lats and the upper back. So I'm not saying it doesn't work, but it costs you a lot. The people who have a naturally good back, people who have a good mind muscle connection with their back, who grows back easily, will grow fine with bent over rows, with bent over barbell rows. Because if your muscle responds very easily to training, it means that you are efficient at sending the activation signal to the muscle, and the muscle responds really well to it. Basically, at the synaptic level means that the part of the muscle, the neuromuscular junction, where the neurological signal enters the muscle and tells the muscle to contract, you can be more or less sensitive to the excitatory drive. So if a muscle is more responsive, it means that at the synaptic level, a smaller amount of activation is required to recruit the fast twitch fibers. So the muscle grows more easily, even if that neural drive is divided over many different muscles. If someone has a harder time building the back, then the barbell row is likely going to be a suboptimal movement, and stuff like chest supported rows, which support you so that you don't have to divide the drive with the lower back. Seated rows, pull downs, and so on, will be more effective than the barbell. All right, guys, very good questions. I actually enjoyed most of them today. It was really fun to answer you guys. Hopefully, you got something from it. So the only thing I can tell you is tell your friends, because the more people we are, the more questions we have, the more we learn together. So hopefully, I'm going to see you next week. So